What do Jackson Pollock, the Los Angeles freeway system, and this 2-year-old's drawing all have in common? They make far more sense to the average person than the maps of many congressional districts in this country. Every 10 years, district maps are redrawn according to the census to ensure fair and equal representation for the population, and yet sometimes we get corrupted maps that stray far from these democratic ideals. These maps are the result of something called gerrymandering, and they can have very real consequences for the people they're meant to represent. So how did it get this way, and how can we make sense of the chaos?
What am I looking at?
In this episode, we're going to connect gerrymandering over here to the Supreme Court over here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And along the way, we'll discuss how we could better understand these lines. Divided into 435 voting seats, the members of the United States House of Representatives make big decisions that affect all of our lives. They have the power to declare wars, establish courts, set our government's budget, and along with state legislatures, they shape and create the laws that run this country. These are elected positions, with each member of the House of Representatives representing a district, and the number of districts in each state is based on population. So it should be pretty easy, right? Count up all the people in the country, that's called the census, and then divide them up evenly. Done and done. Except wait. What if politicians were able to rig the system so that they could keep getting elected year after year? What if they were able to move the lines around districts to dilute the concentration of voters from multiple areas, also known as cracking? Or what if you could concentrate many voters of one type into a single electoral district to reduce their influence in other districts? That's called packing. That would be pretty great job security for an elected official, right? So maybe the politicians try to just shuffle a few people from over here to over here, so they know that their supporters are the majority in their district. Basically, what if the politicians were able to choose their voters instead of voters choosing them? Well, this hypothetical is a reality, and it has been for a very long time. To explain it, we first need to talk about salamanders. Okay, stick with me for a second. Salamanders are those small and slimy amphibious creatures that you might see in the wild, or just on some beach graphic t-shirt. There are thousands of species of them, but the one we're going to focus on today is from Massachusetts. You see, in 1812, Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts, and his party was working to ensure the re-election of many of their Jeffersonian Republican counterparts. Gerry signed into law legislation that redrew district boundaries to enhance the Jeffersonian Republicans' hold on state and federal offices. In response, the Federalists, rivals of the Jeffersonians, attacked the absurdity of these new district lines with a political cartoon in the Boston Gazette. They pointed out that the new district looked a lot like, and here's where we come back to it, they said it looked like a monstrous salamander. So to mock Elbridge Gerry for signing the absurd and manipulative legislation that created the salamander district, they gave the creature a new name, the Gerrymander. Over time, it eventually switched to the gerrymander that we know today.
Jerry. God, they're both horrible.
Side note, the uproar around this unfair redistricting actually helped lead to Elbridge Gerry not winning the re-election that year. So even in the beginning, people knew redistricting like this was unfair. So according to the Constitution, the states all govern their own elections, but Congress may at any time make laws that alter the regulations for congressional elections. And in 1842, Congress makes one. The Apportionment Act of, 1842. This requires that every state use districts to elect their representatives, rather than, for example, just sending representatives from whichever party is the majority in the state or picking your representatives based on their wealth. Then in 1872, Congress passed another Apportionment Act, saying that districts should attempt to be equal by size of population, which seems reasonable. Then in 1901, Congress passed another Apportionment Act clarifying that a district needs to be a contiguous territory. You can't take this corner of the state and lump it together with this corner of the state. All these acts help define what a district is and how its borders should be drawn, but they didn't protect the people within these districts, and much of this was happening after the Civil War. The South had lost the war and slavery had not only ended, but the 15th Amendment gave freed slaves the right to vote. So if the South couldn't draw districts that could exclude slaves, then the Southern legislators would need to disenfranchise them in other ways, like making voter registration more difficult, and using hate groups like the KKK to intimidate black voters. And it wasn't just the disenfranchisement of black voters. Rural, largely white districts were anti-urban because urban areas had more people of color and foreigners, which brings up the fact that many people were anti-immigrant and didn't want people who moved to the United States having a fair and equal vote. So they would try to make sure their districts didn't include as many of these people as possible, and then they would disenfranchise the rest. In general, I refer to this mindset as NIMBY. It's like the voting version of being NIMBY, you know, not in my district, yard. You get it. And the disenfranchisement of black voters continued. Well, frankly, it continues throughout the country today. But 100 years after the Civil War, the Supreme Court started to address it. First, in 1962, they made the Baker ruling, which established that the courts do have the power to rule in questions of redistricting. Then the next year, in 1963, the Supreme Court ruled in Gray v. Sanders that a system the state of Georgia was using, that weighted votes by county, was unconstitutional because it gave unequal voting power to smaller counties. This established the one-person, one-vote standard. Then the very next year, in 1964, the court ruled in two cases, Reynolds v. Sims and Westbury v. Sanders. These two cases established that both state legislatures and the U.S. House of Representatives must have representatives from districts of roughly equal population, which sounds a lot like the Apportionment Act of 1872 that I mentioned before, except it was almost 100 years later and no one was listening to the Apportionment Act of 1872. And with a title that dry, I mean, can you blame them? So that's the Supreme Court of the 60s, the Warren Court. But what about our final connection, the Supreme Court of today, the Roberts Court? How is this court protecting the Warren Court's legacy of one person, one vote, and protecting the voting rights of all Americans today? Well, the short answer is, it isn't. This court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, a landmark legislation that prohibits racial discrimination in voting and which has protected the right to vote for all people since 1965. In multiple cases, the Roberts Court has dismantled the provisions of that act, allowing states to make it harder to vote. And then if we remember Elbridge Gerry and his salamander district, in 2019, the Roberts Court heard a case on partisan gerrymandering. In the case Rucho versus Common Cause, in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court stated that redistricting based on partisanship is a political matter and therefore couldn't be adjudicated in the federal court system, saying, even if gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles, it does not mean that the solution lies with the federal judiciary. So the Roberts Court essentially reversed what the Warren Court established in the 1962 Baker ruling. Basically, the court held its nose and said, it may smell foul, but we'll allow it, essentially leaving fewer barriers to powerful groups, manipulating the redistricting process in order to maintain their power over our government. So the census just happened, and states are drawing up new district maps left and right. What can you do to ensure that politicians in your state aren't making salamanders or starfish or Jeff Goldblums for their own aims? The most important thing you could do is stay informed. Follow what's happening, look for opportunities for public comment of engagement, and contact your local officials handling the redistricting process. Everyone is going to need to work together to make sure that no one's vote is lost or minimized in this process. Remember, redistricting doesn't have to make monstrous creatures. It has the potential to stay true to the values of our Constitution, and as the Warren Court put it, allow for one person, one vote. Be sure to like and subscribe to be alerted of more videos in the future. So stay tuned and keep watching Let's Connect. Thank you.